All right. She's a fantastic law professor over at the University of Richmond, but she's got a new book that's coming out now. I'm holding it here for the people watching on YouTube. It's called Secrets of the Killing State, The Untold Story of Lethal Injection. And that is Corinna Lain. Corinna, Mike Leon, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Yeah, I love the page one folks over there. They love sending us authors and books and subject matter experts about different things. This book caught my eye because, and there was obviously an executive order by President Trump that we're going to get into in just a second that happened earlier in the year around this and the story of lethal injection and killing prisoners and things of that nature. So what I do want to ask you first at a high level is tell our audience a little bit about this book and what made you want to write it.
The short answer is I didn't want to write it. That is the absolute truth. I'm a death penalty researcher. I've been working on the death penalty and studying it for about 18 years. So one of the things I kept noticing was, all of these botched executions. And it raised a question as a death penalty researcher, why can't states, why are they so fantastically bad at something that we do to humanely put down our pets every single day? And so I started, researching why they couldn't figure this out. And I thought it was going to be an article. It insisted upon being a book. I did not want to write a book. So I actually set it down for about a month. And then prayerfully, what went back to it. There's a whole story of my faith journey that is about this, the backstory, the story behind the book. But in the end, I said, in January 2018, I walked away from that encounter and said, I'm supposed to write a book on lethal injection, and that's what I'm going to do.
Well, the book, I tell you something. I read the story about, and you were talking about botched injections about the Kenny Smith in Alabama. And so I'm reading this part in the book. And for people that don't know the story about this man they tried to execute him in 2022. It was unsuccessful, which we can get into how, like you said, botched injections of trying to put someone down. And then in 24, he was executed. Alabama said it went without hiccup. Meanwhile, people in the room were like, no, there was a lot of hiccups and a lot of issues with it. So I want to get into all of this stuff, but let me ask you first at a high level, because the executive order that came out back in January, you're talking about the death penalty, and obviously the Trump administration's position on lethal killings has been, they've directed Attorney General Pam Bondi, to take all the necessary and lawful action, I'm reading here from the executive order, to ensure states that use lethal injection for death sentences have a sufficient supply. So when you saw this executive order come back, and you can tie it to the book, obviously, but what were some of, your emotions, or at least being in this space, what were some of the things maybe right or wrong with respect to this executive order? And what are some of the things that it highlights in terms of how we, kill folks that are on death row?
Well, it was a day one executive order. And so it was part of a slew of executive orders. But I mean, I looked at it, and that executive order is basically, let's execute everybody that's on death row. Let's get this thing done. We're going to get you the drugs. And by the way, go for death whenever you can, and go for death in some places where you can't. Let's challenge that in the courts and move it. And so you see the states, it was just this huge death penalty push. And so if you're asking what was my emotion in that moment, I thought, this book is basically walking into a buzzsaw. I will be coming in, at the crossroads of where we are today. But that was my initial emotional response. And then, I don't know, within hours, I'm thinking, wait a minute. Those are words. They're just words. And frankly, the death penalty is dying in this country, and lethal injection is broken for reasons that an executive order can't fix. This book is much bigger than the executive order. And, as far as the death penalty itself goes, death sentencing is your best sort of indicator of the future of the death penalty, because today's death sentences are tomorrow's executions. You don't have death sentences feeding into the machinery of death. It's going to die on the vine. And by the way, that was Virginia's story. Virginia abolished in 2021. But, if you look at death sentencing is down over the past 2 decades, over 80%. So, 2004, there were 125 death sentences. 2024, which is the last year that we have full data, was like 26, 26. So, and all of that gets to deeper problems. People now know more about actual innocence on death row. And there was a National Academy of Sciences study that found about 4%. It's actually 4.1% of all people currently on death row are factually innocent. Now, we don't know who they are, and they're all saying it's me. So, like, that's its own problem. But, actual innocence, they know about racism in the death penalty in ways that I think they didn't before. And so, there's, there's not great support for it. And so, these are things, by the way, if you look at Gallup polls, a lot of people think, oh, the death penalty, people support the death penalty. Not so much. The latest Gallup poll, and Gallup, checks this every single year. The latest Gallup poll last November, 53%. 53%. That's it. And among millennials, it was 47%. And among Gen Z, it was 43%. So, these are larger trends that an executive order can't fix.
Which is funny because and my co-host who couldn't join us today for this interview actually had written out, what do you find public opinion on state sanctioned
So there you go.
execution? So there you go, right? So the Gallup poll, and Gallup, one of the leading voices out there in terms of conducting
Mhm.
surveys and research. I alluded to it before about the botch killing of Kenny Smith, and you were mentioning there was a prisoner. I feel like this happened during the transition period between Biden and Trump. There was a prisoner that was on death row that, like, the state of execution. I forget what state it was in, but it ended up going through. This was recently in the news, if you recall that story. I didn't want to ask a question on that. I wanted to ask more about Kenny Smith's thing, because you mentioned it in the book, and I want you to get into this about cover-ups and the capital punishment. States sometimes breaking laws, maybe bending laws a little bit. So, can you,
Breaking.
yeah, can you tell the public, like, what do you want the public to take away about? And you can even go into the example of Kenny Smith and this injection in your answer, but, like, what do you want the public to really understand about lethal injection, whether it's inhumane or not, or the practices of it? Like, what do you want the central theme for folks to take away about this from the book?
Mike, thank you for this question. So, this is not a book where I make an argument and try to convince you I'm right. This is a book where I relentlessly document what states are doing in our name and leave it to readers to decide if that's okay with you. And, that having been said, I think it would be really hard to walk away from this book and think that lethal injection is humane. States are telling us it's humane, and they have been from the start, and with nothing to back that up. They just, are just asserting that it is humane. And in some ways, that's how it looks when all goes as planned. But we could talk about, the fact that states that use the three-drug protocol, which is the traditional protocol, one of the drugs in there is a paralytic, and it's also a muscle relaxant. So it relaxes the muscles in the face and then it freezes them that way. So you're going to look like you peacefully went to sleep, even though that's not necessarily what happens. So we're now looking at, the scientists are now looking at autopsies, and it's like 84% of the autopsies are showing that these people are actually dying by drowning in their own fluids. And so, as one court said, we're essentially waterboarding people to death, and so I talk about that and lay out all of the things about that. I do document states, violating state and federal laws Courts have found this. The FDA has seized their drugs. The DEA has seized their drugs. They're doing, buys under the table in cash. I document time after time where they're grabbing $10,000, $15,000 in cash. Sometimes in a suitcase, I think sometimes in a bag, I don't know. But, and they're like driving across the border, renting a plane. There's an allegation that officials in Idaho who chartered a private plane and took it to Washington with, I think it was $15,000 in a suitcase. And the allegation was they did the buy in a Walmart parking lot, and the officials came out and said it was not at Walmart. I'm like, okay, but the plane landed at 5:30 and by the time you would have gotten there, it was closed. And there is a Walmart across, a block away. So like, who knows? But there's all kinds of stuff happening. And, to go to directly to your point, the one of the huge problems is secrecy. And that's why I titled the book Secrets of the Killing State, because, here I am, a death penalty researcher. I'm supposed to be an expert in this stuff. And I'm looking at it going, I didn't know any of this. I had no idea. So there's no way that the public knows this stuff is happening. And Kenny Smith is a really nice example of that. Do you want me to, okay. Yeah, I can
Yeah.
keep talking. So with Kenny Smith, it was the nation's, actually the world's first execution with nitrogen gas. And just to back up a moment, Oklahoma was the first state to adopt nitrogen gas, and Oklahoma adopted it, its legislature adopted it based on a 14-page report, double spaced, unpublished, by three professors at a local college uh, that were all criminal justice or sociology people, none of whom had any medical expertise whatsoever. And so I talk about that in the book, and I talk about how one of them said, we couldn't get any doctors to help us, so we just did the best we could. And it's so problematic that and just so laden with typos. Even on the cover, one of the author's names is misspelled. So just to give you an idea that that's what's behind, that's the type of science that's behind these methods. But in any event, Alabama follows, Oklahoma adopts it and conducts the first execution, and that's Kenny Smith. Um, Afterwards, the Department of Corrections official comes out and says, that's textbook. It's exactly what we expected. It went according to plan. And in fact, even goes on to say, we've now done it and shown it's effective. Other states can too. Follow us. But what in fact happened was it took over 20 minutes. He was retching inside the mask. He's gagging. Media observers who were there, veteran media, said, I've witnessed a lot of executions. I've never seen one so violent. It was so violent. He's shaking and seizing, and it shook the gurney. It was so violent, and that's just what observers saw outside the from the witness room. He also had his spiritual advisor in there with him, and for the sake of your listeners, I won't go into what he said, but it was disgustingly gross, and what he was seeing. And one other data point: the uh the slain victim's son was there to witness, and he came out of that and said to media, that's just something I never, ever want to see again. And, it turns out that even if you wanted a person to die for what they did, watching someone being tortured to death is just a grotesque experience. And he went on to say that he went back to his hotel room, and the press meeting was happening and the Department of Corrections spokesman was up. And here's the victim's son. And he said, I just stood there and listened to it. And only about half of what he said was correct, was true. And he said, I wasn't expecting that. And man, doesn't that just encapsulate the whole thing, right? Is that what states are telling us? Like we assume it's true. I did. I did. And I come to you as a former prosecutor. You
You
know,
know,
I,
Corinna, and I didn't want to cut you off there,
no,
but
no.
I did want to ask you because as you're talking there, a lot of things are resonating with me, and I'm drawing a parallel, and I want to use your legal expertise. As I mentioned before, you teach law over at the University of Richmond, fantastic school, by the way, and there's parallels to what is happening. Again, not apples to apples with the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case with respect to deporting people. Well, he's a gang member. So what's the difference? We're
Mm,
just sending them that way. Well, this person's on death row. What's the difference? Let's just kill them anyway. And I started thinking of that. And, again, I don't feel this way. So this question is always, and I hate when people tend to do this, which is like, people will say, it's like, well, I don't know if people will say, but I do want to ask you this devil's advocate question type thing. It's like, hey, these folks are on death row. These folks have been tried by a jury of their peers. They've been convicted, right? They've committed heinous crimes. We're killing them. The Trump administration, like you said, hey, let's speed this up. Let's get them the drugs. Let's get them out of here. Let's get them on their way to their next voyage, right? As callous as that sounds, that's what they're doing with respect to the executive order. Do you see some of these parallels, and how would you answer somebody that maybe is listening to this interview or has seen the book and bookstore and says, I don't care about how we're killing these folks.
mm.
These folks are monsters. They've already had their day in court and they lost. Let's get rid of them.
Yeah, that's such an important question. So I'm really glad you answered it or asked it. So I've got really several answers, but I'm going to stick with two. And one of them is a direct parallel to the deportation, like directly. And that is the conversations around the death penalty always focus on, does he deserve to die? Right? He did this terrible thing. Does he deserve to die? But frankly, that's only half of the equation. The other half is, has the state done what it needs to do to deserve to take that life? Right? And it's the same with deportation. Maybe, I mean, it's wrong in this case, but like maybe there are people that should be deported, but that doesn't mean you can just grab them and stick them on planes without any process whatsoever. Like you get process. Why? Because we live under the rule of law. And if your government is not abiding by the rule of law, the entire social structure breaks down, right? The government has to abide by the rule of law. And this book really, again, I don't make an argument, I just show you. But this book is a book about all the ways that the state cannot be trusted with the ultimate power, which is killing on purpose one of its own, and all the ways that the state has tried to cover that up. So like that's one answer, but I want to get to the other aspect component of the question you asked, which isn't so much like the death penalty per se, but like why should we care that we are torturing them? Look, and let me just put it more strongly, right? Like, well, maybe this person committed, tortured their victim. Why should we care if they suffer when they die themselves? And so teeing that up, I've thought about that. And one of the things I think about when I hear that question or when I think about it, is why don't we why don't we rape rapists? And I'm not saying like why don't we let's like I'm not saying that. I'm saying we don't, right? And look, a private citizen might be like, well, I hope bad things happen to them in jail. But like that is nothing a court would ever, like ever do. Why don't we burn down arsonists' homes? Why don't we take the people that made someone else suffer a torturous death? Why don't we just take out the rack and screw? Right? Like, why not torture them? Why not embrace it? And the answer is those types of things would allow us to get even with someone but a civilized society can't stoop that low, right? Like we can't, they're the bad guys. We're the good guys, right? And so we can't use the bad guys' conduct as the standard for our own. We have to be better than, the savagery that we're punishing. Because what we're saying is that's so bad, that's so unacceptable to society that you don't belong here anymore. And even if the people were to say that is true, we can't say that the very conduct that's so bad is going to be the standard for our own. And, that concept is what we see in the Eighth Amendment Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause, right? It says we will not, torture someone. We will not have a cruel punishment, even when the person was cruel to someone else. Um, and it's not because they don't deserve it in some talionic eye for an eye way. It's because it would demean us.
Eye for an eye makes the whole world blind.
There you go.
That's the saying. Speaking of eye for an eye, I believe, and this is from my co-host Nick Severi, who texted me this morning when he knew you were coming on, and he loves the book. He wanted to say hello.
All right.
5 states allow for execution by firing squad. Is that correct? When you talk to these folks that are death row inmates, have you found, you talked about in the book the way the states have covered up or botched lethal injections, and everyone knows how torturous, just from the Kenny Smith story, just as an outlier, of how torturous this can be. I would have to think death by firing squad would be even way worse. Have you ever found anyone, maybe this sounds like the stupidest question of all time, someone
No.
that's like, hey, you know what? I'd prefer the firing squad method than this lethal injection and what this arduous process that I've heard of other inmates that have suffered.
Yeah. Well, not only have I heard of it, but that is South Carolina's story. South
Right.
Carolina has now executed 2 people by firing squad. South Carolina has every state's a little different. South Carolina has an interesting little scheme, and I say a legal their legal death penalty scheme where you can actually choose. So it allows prisoners to choose how they will die. And 2 of them just this year chose death by firing squad. And that was after South Carolina had executed someone by lethal injection. It took 22 minutes. The drugs didn't work. They had to do a second round of them because the person's, still there and struggling. Um, Here's another one that's super interesting. Tennessee also has this very same statutory scheme. And 5 of the last 7 prisoners that Tennessee has executed have chosen to be executed by the electric chair rather than lethal injection. And the electric chair, again, to save your listeners, but it is a ghastly affair. And suffice it to say, the electric chair is the only execution method that 2 states have themselves said, this is cruel and unusual punishment under our state constitutional law, under the state Eighth Amendment Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause. So it is a terrible, terrible death. And yet, 5 of 7 chose it. Why? And what they said, and by the way, I should clarify, they didn't say this to me. I have made certain research choices not to talk to people myself. So everything I have found is based in research. Because if I talk to some people, then I think I have to talk to other people. And I don't trust necessarily the sources and didn't want to inject dubious sources into my research. So it's all what I found. But anyway, what they said was we knew both deaths would be torturous. And so our best move was to make it quick. Electric chair is generally under 5 minutes, usually takes 2 to 3. Firing squad, the heart stops in about 15 seconds. Lethal injection, between 10 to 20 minutes if it goes as planned. And the going average for the 1 drug protocol, 18 minutes.
Unbelievable. And again, when Page One reached out to have you on the show, and I got the copy of the book. I started reading this and I'm like, why would I care? But back to the overarching point, why would I care about how these people are dying? And then as you start reading the book, you made me care, Corinna. Like you made
Oh.
me care about the way the states are handling this, the secrecy. So I'm very glad that you titled it with that. But you're right. This is something that, and again, that executive order, remember, he signed about 87 executive orders that day. So that kind of flew under the radar in terms of coverage. So I'm so happy that you wrote something about this and we were able to get you on the show. I did want to ask you this question because we love asking authors this question, and a lot of authors have really liked it. So we're going to keep it going, which is, there's a bookstore and you've got a bunch of book appearances
Mm.
coming up, which people can go to your website at CorinnaLain.com, Lain, Lain.com. And we'll have links and all that to in our show notes. But you're at a bookstore, your book is on the counter, you see somebody picking it up, they start reading it, right? You tap them on the shoulder, you say, hey, I wrote that book. Give them the pitch as to why they should buy this book.
This is what the state's doing in your name. And this is the state at its most powerful moment. And I promise you, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, this book will tell you things that you didn't know, will cause you to question things, and will matter to you. And by the way, I had, Mike, so that's what I would say. But I had a group of beta readers, and they came up with book club questions. Those are also on the website. But very interesting, one of the questions that was recurring in each of the chapters, not every single one of them, but it was, did you want to know what the person did at the beginning of this chapter? Did you want to know? Hey, yeah, but who did they kill? And, who did they rape and murder? At the end of the chapter, after reading it, did you still want to know what they did? And every single one of them said, no, I was so offended by what the state is doing in our name that it didn't matter what they did. That's not, they're the state, right? That's not what we should be doing. And it's especially not what we should be doing in the dark. It's not, democracy requires transparency.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm spilling a whole bunch of tea. So,
I know you are. And look, we've had tons of legal analysts on this show, obviously talking about different things moving with respect to not only this administration, but anything that doesn't give people their due process and their day in court. So go check out the book, Secrets of the Killing State, The Untold Story of Lethal Injection. And you can go, like I mentioned, to CorinnaLain.com to find out when that book tour is happening. You got a couple of dates coming up in May across Baltimore, Washington, D.C., where people can go see you. University of Richmond Law. If you're a student over there, listen to your professor, please, because obviously she knows what she's talking about in terms of research. Corinna, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program. Continued success to you and the book, and you're welcome back anytime. Stay safe.
thanks so much, Mike. It was such a pleasure talking with you.